Grazie mille. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to be back in Italy and to be back in Vignola and to be talking about cherries, a true passion of mine. And I know it's a true passion of any cherry grower, because if you don't have passion for cherries, how could you possibly stand the rain, the frost, the climate change, etc.? So congratulations to you. I hope to bring you some new ideas today to think about implementing in your orchard and to help you deal with climate change. I'd like to begin by talking about revolutionary technologies. When we're talking about revolutionary technologies in cherry production, I think we begin by talking about the genetic and breeding improvements, particularly self-fertility. The 1980s, the 1990s brought us Stella and Lapins and Sweetheart, which gave us consistent fruit set and consistent yields, a huge impact for marketing. Then in the 1990s and 2000s, the rain covers, starting in places like the United Kingdom, where if you don't have rain covers, you don't have cherries. Places like Norway, you must have rain covers. Now we see rain covers around the world to protect against cherry cracking, but also to help us deal with climate change. That has also given us more reliable yields, and that's affected the market opportunities that we have. Then in the 2000s, dwarfing rootstocks, particularly from Germany, the Gisela series, and there are others, have made a huge impact. In the Netherlands alone, the cherry industry has increased 100% from 2000 to 2011. So a 10-year period, 100% increase because of the increased labor efficiencies brought to us by the revolutionary technology of dwarfing rootstocks. Putting all of these different factors together has required physiology. When we produce more cherries, when we produce them on smaller trees, when we produce them under different covers, we need to have a good fundamental understanding of the physiology of how a cherry grows in order to optimize these other revolutionary technologies. So I believe that we'll be using physiology, the fundamental understanding of cherries, to help us with the future challenges of labor efficiencies and fruit quality and also climate change. So the first factors I'd like to talk about physiologically are water. Water is needed for photosynthesis. Water is needed for the nutrients to be taken up into your trees. And water is needed for the turgor pressure that drives the expansion of fruit and gives us that large fruit size that makes a difference between an average cherry and a superlative cherry. We also need to think about these dwarfing trees. Smaller root systems require more frequent delivery of small amounts of water in order to optimize photosynthesis and the nutrient uptake. When we think about nutrients, nutrients are driving the size of our leaves, how well the tree has stored nitrogen and how well the tree is taking up nitrogen improves our leaf size, which improves our photosynthesis, which improves the fruit flavor and the firmness and the texture of the fruit. Smaller root systems, again, require more frequent delivery of small amounts of nutrients, so the tree is always supplied. This is a huge change from the old days with large root systems where growers would fertilize once in the season and irrigate every 1 or 2 weeks. We'd like to see now very frequent delivery of water and nutrients. And there's been a beautiful study by our colleagues Denise and Jerry Nielsen in Canada where they looked at this question of high-frequency irrigation and fertigation. They provided 4 times each day small amounts of water and nutrients, evenly spaced at different times throughout the day. The amount of water they applied each day replaced that amount of water that was used the day before, the evapotranspiration. They provided nitrogen and calcium for 8 weeks, beginning just after bloom. They provided 4 weeks of potassium and boron, beginning at the stage of pit hardening, stage 2. They found that this high-frequency irrigation and fertigation helps compensate for that reduced root-to-fruit ratio. It improved canopy growth by 80% on dwarfing Gisela 5 rootstocks. It improved yield by 55% and fruit size by 4%. These are the cumulative effects over 7 years of their research. So that's water and nutrients. Let's focus for most of the rest of my talk on photosynthesis and how we can optimize that in training systems. Photosynthesis, as I said, acquires the carbon from the air, turns it into sugar. That gives us our sweetness, our fruit size, and our yield. So the interception of light is the carbon gain by the tree, and that is directly proportional to the potential yield we can get from the orchard. Something we've not thought near as much about is shade in the orchard. Shade is where we have a net carbon loss at times, which can negatively affect our fruit quality. The fruit in the shade is not as sweet, it's not as firm, and growing sites for fruit in the tree, if they become too shady, they are lost, and that affects long-term orchard productivity. So 20 years ago, as we were learning about dwarfing rootstocks, we started asking the questions, does this genetic revolution affect physiologically photosynthesis and the relationship between fruits and leaves? So we took Bing cherry on Gisela 5 rootstock. We had a normal crop load of 84 fruit per square meter of leaf area. We thinned another tree to the 20 fruit per square meter of leaf area, so 25% of the normal crop load. And one tree, we took all of the fruit away. So we had 3 different crop loads. How did this affect photosynthesis? Changing those crop loads did not change photosynthesis of individual leaves or the photosynthesis of the entire canopy. But we saw with a higher crop load, of course, we had higher yields, but decreased fruit size, sugar, firmness, and tree growth. So photosynthesis is limiting. So the question is, how do we design our trees to maximize that photosynthesis and keep our fruit-to-leaf ratios in a balance to achieve both good yields and good fruit quality? So we looked at the ratio of the leaf area to fruit. So along the bottom of the axis here is leaf area to fruit ratio, and you can see early in this graph a little bit of increase in leaf area per fruit ratio gives us a large increase in fruit soluble solids on the bottom and on fruit size on the top graph. So what we saw was the fruit size and sugar approached maximum levels when the leaf area to fruit ratio was around 210 to 250 square centimeters of leaf for every fruit. That roughly translates to about 2 or 3 shoot leaves per fruit or 4 to 8 spur leaves. 10 years, 12 years later, my colleagues in Canada, once again, the Nielsen's, Jerry and Denise, looked at a different variety with 3 different rootstocks, Gisela 3, 5, and 6, and 3 different training systems in the orchard, TSA, UFO, and KGB. And they again looked at leaf area to fruit ratio on the bottom axis and fruit size. Once again, we see that a large fruit, around a 12-gram fruit, required 210 to 250 square centimeters of leaf area per fruit. So this raises the question, how do we manage that leaf area? We have a great advantage with smaller trees. It's easier to envision the crop load and the leaf area. So I went to grapes to think about how the grape people manage crop loads. They make most of their crop load decisions when they're pruning. If they spur prune, they know the number of spurs per cordon. They know the number of buds that they leave per spur. They know they'll have 2 clusters of fruit for every bud. And so by pruning, they can achieve a relatively precise crop load. How do we accomplish that in sweet cherry was one of our first questions. So I took a sweet cherry tree and started trying to grow it like a grapevine so that I could break it down into individual shoots, which are so much easier to quantify the leaf area and the fruit. And when this became known as the UFO training system. And I'll finish the presentation talking about how that has compared over the last 9 years to other training systems. But the next question we asked physiologically was, which of the leaves in that small quantified tree canopy are providing carbon to the fruit that's developing? Is it the non-fruiting spur leaves? Is it the new shoot leaves? Or is it the fruiting spur leaves? Or what combinations among those? So my student Marlene Ayala, who was a picture there, used carbon-13 CO2 to allow photosynthesis of the spur leaves, and she saw that at stage 1 of fruit growth, 49% of that carbon that was going to the fruits was coming from those fruiting spur leaves. And that stayed pretty consistent through stage 2, through stage 3, through the rapid phase of growth, all the way to harvest. When she looked at the non-fruiting spur leaves, it was more like 30%. It started out with 40% of the carbon coming into the fruit from the non-fruiting spur leaves, and then it fell to 30% through most of the rest of production. And that new shoot that's growing out at the very end starts out providing about 10% of the carbon going into the fruit, but as that new shoot grows, it provides an increasing amount all the way up to 25%. But what we saw was 70 to 90% of the carbon going into the fruit through development was coming from those spur leaves. So the next factor is to think about sun exposure. As I said, the higher the proportion of fruit that is exposed to sunlight, the more uniform the fruit will be in ripening and in quality and in post-harvest performance. And that percentage of exposure is related to yield. Sun-exposed fruit will lose more water than shaded fruit, but this also drives more sugar and more nutrients into that fruit, giving us a higher quality fruit. So fruit exposed to the light, as opposed to being in the shade in a canopy, tend to be higher in sugars, higher in overall dry matter and calcium, that's what drives fruit texture, and higher in color, particularly for blush cherries like Rainier. So capturing light, how can we maximize that capture of light? And we can go back to thinking about the cherry tree evolved over centuries to optimize its capture of light. Let's look and learn from the tree itself. So here we look at how a leaf is developed. The first leaf grows. Where does the next leaf appear? It appears at 137 degrees away from the first leaf, because that's as far away as it needs to be to capture light and not shade not only that leaf, but also then the next leaf, leaf number 3, and so on, until we have 8 leaves around the growth of the tree, the new shoot, that has optimally captured sunlight without shading any other leaves. So we can watch a cherry tree grow. The first leaf, the second leaf, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, seventh, and eighth. So this was the evolutionary strategy of a cherry to maximize its light capture. How can we then use this trait in orchard training systems? Well, as the tree moves from year 1 to year 2, we see that same formation of leaves, and the branches, the new shoots, will also form at this same pattern. This is a pattern quantified by the great Italian mathematician Fibonacci. And so we see a very highly efficient capture of light moving into year 2 with new shoots. But now we start to break down in the efficiency of the cherry tree, because in year 3, as we move to a 3-dimensional canopy, now we get a lot more branching. And so the tree is competing in the forest for light, and it can accomplish that by having some inefficiencies of shade. But we're now growing a tree out of the forest. We're growing it in our orchard. So how do we start to avoid this shade inefficiency? So let's look at some of the different training systems, and now we think about not only light interception, but also shade. Where is the shade occurring? In a central leader tree, we have a cylinder of shade. In a spindle tree, we have a cone of shade. In a bush tree, we have the center of the tree potentially in shade. But we go back to that thin, narrow, grape-like canopy, and we see we have very, very little shade. We have a tremendous amount of sunlight interception and a very small amount of shade. So here are UFO trees in Washington State. You see beautiful distribution of sunlight, evenness of ripening up and down these vertical growing sections, all the way down the row. So in 2010, we put together a training system trial looking at the Kim Green Bush, tall spindle axe, super slender axe training system out of Italy, and the UFO, upright fruiting offshoots. We looked at these four systems with three different vigors of rootstock. Gisela 3 dwarfing, Gisela 5 semi-dwarfing, and Gisela 6 semi-vigorous. We wanted to see the interaction between these different vigors of rootstock and the different canopy architectures. And when we look at these training systems, I'd like you to think about that fruiting branch. Where do those fruiting branches, that very efficient fruiting branch, how does that occur in these different training systems? So if we're always breaking down our tree now, as we move to small trees, we can think about how to optimize our physiology and our fruit yields. So I won't go into how the details are of pruning and training. I think Martin will cover some details of pruning and training, but you can download this book for free, 63-page book from the internet. It covers those four training systems and 3 or 4 others. Simply go to our website. It's also available as a downloadable form on your phone or on your iPad. And it's also available in Spanish, not Italian, but Spanish, so perhaps that would be of help. So this just shows you the sort of things we put in this book. We describe the system, how to use the rootstocks, how to space the trees, how to train the tree year after year after year. So that was the TSA, the SSA, the UFO, and the Kim Green Bush. So what are the results of this training system trial, looking at these different architectures and these different rootstock vigors? Well, we break this down into 3-dimensional training systems, the Kim Green Bush and the tall spindle axe, and 2-dimensional systems. So with the 3-dimensional systems, we see the area taken up in the orchard by these canopies ranges from 2 to 1.5 meters wide. But we move to the 2-dimensional, the SSA and the UFO, and now we're below 1 meter in width. We're as narrow in the UFO as 0.25 meters of permanent fruiting wood every year. So you can see the tremendous difference not only in potential light interception, but in potential shade. So here is our orchard under our retractable roof rain cover, TSA, SSA, KGB, UFO. Here are the results of those 9 years. Our first yield was in year 4 because in year 3 we had frost and it eliminated the crop. So the very first year, we see that the SSA planted on the most dwarfing rootstock, the Gisela 3, was the highest and most productive. So it's the most precocious training system rootstock combination. SSA and GI3 were the most precocious, followed by Gisela 3 on the TSA and the UFO on Gisela 3. In the next year, year 5, we see that now the KGB, well, we see now the TSA has become most productive, and you can see the KGB and Gisela 6 are the least precocious. The virtue of making a lot of pruning cuts for that training system delays the productivity early on. We move to year 6, so 3 years of growth, 3 years of production, and the highest yielding training systems after the first 3 yields are the TSA and the UFO on Gisela 3, followed by the KGB on Gisela 3, the SSA on Gisela 3, and the UFO on Gisela 5. So that's the early picture of the orchard. And the question is, can we maintain those yields, or might they change as the tree finishes filling its space and more growers are pruning to contain the tree within its space? Are we developing shade that could possibly limit our potential yields? So we look to year 7. In year 7, the UFO on Gisela 3 was most productive. We move to year 8, and most productive was the UFO and the SSA on Gisela 3, followed by the KGB on Gisela 3 and the UFO on Gisela 5. We move to year 9, and we see that the KGB on Gisela 3 and the UFO on Gisela 5 were the most productive that year, but over the entire 3-year period, that UFO on Gisela 3 is also very productive. So now we can compare the mature orchard against the young orchard, and we see that the KGB on Gisela 3 had equal yields for young trees and old trees. They increased in productivity on Gisela 5 and 6 with age. The SSA decreased slightly with age and was equal on Gisela 6, which is a bad combination. The TSA decreased with age. So we were getting probably too much shade in the center of that TSA canopy, and we were losing productivity. In the UFO, we increased productivity on the Gisela 3, the Gisela 5, and we were equal on Gisela 6. So overall, we can say in this trial through 9 years, the most productive over 9 years was UFO on Gisela 3, followed by UFO on Gisela 5, which was equal to TSA on Gisela 3, SSA on Gisela 3, and KGB on Gisela 3. So that was our project. That was Michigan with the variety Benton. We also had identical trials with the Nielsen's in Canada and in New York with Cornell University and up in Nova Scotia. And different varieties. It was Skeena in Canada and it was Regina in New York. So how did those trials fare after the last date? This is 2017, so this is after 8 years. Well, in British Columbia with Skeena, the highest yields were UFO on both Gisela 3 and Gisela 5. Our highest yields were on Gisela 3 and UFO with Benton. And with Regina, the highest yield was with Gisela 5 and UFO. So we're seeing the very narrow UFO training system providing very high yields across multiple locations in New York, in North America, and across multiple varieties, and even across 2 different rootstocks. So the other nice advantage, as I wrap up this talk, is to talk about the efficiencies that come with such a narrow canopy. This is the amount of time taken to pick 1 kilogram of fruit. So it takes 4.4 minutes to pick 1 kilogram of fruit in a UFO, 5% longer in a KGB, 10% longer in a SSA, and in our more traditional tall spindle tree, it takes almost 40% more time to pick 1 kilo of fruit. So even if the yields are equal between the TSA and these other training systems, a grower is paying more money to pick the same amount of fruit. So we're moving towards better efficiencies as we redesign our canopy architectures. So we can now use mechanized platforms more efficiently with a narrow fruiting wall. We can possibly mechanize flower thinning. We can mechanize some of our pruning with hedging. And here are just a few pictures around the world. This is a UFO orchard in Washington State, a UFO orchard in New Zealand where more than 100 hectares are planted on UFO training systems with non-precocious rootstocks even, with colt rootstock. It's very easy to cover a small, narrow canopy with a small cover that doesn't trap too much heat. We can train that UFO architecture into 2 fruiting walls to increase the light interception and increase the potential yield. Here's a VUFO in Washington. Here's VUFO and vertical UFO in Chile on Cab 6P rootstock. And so our most recent study that I'll leave you with is we're looking at trying to grow not a V architecture, but 2 very closely planted parallel double wall of trees to increase the overall light interception, but to also maintain the potential efficiencies of the vertical walls for hedging and flower thinning and for picking. So that's the little bit of work I have to share with you today. I'll also point out that we have training video clips. You can go on the internet and see how to prune and train some of these different training systems. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time.